If your child woke up in a hospital bed and whispered the name of the person who tried to kill him, would you believe it? Because the night my 9-year-old son Mason was hit by a car, everyone told me it was an accident. The police, the doctors, even my own husband. But when Mason opened his eyes in the ICU, he grabbed my hand and whispered something that turned my entire life upside down. He said the man who pushed him into traffic wasn't a stranger, it was my husband. And months later, in a packed courtroom in Fulton County, that same man would finally stand up and scream the truth himself. Chapter 1. The Night Everything Changed. Most people think the worst night of your life arrives with warning signs, sirens in the distance, a storm rolling in, a feeling in your stomach that something bad is coming. For me, it started like any other Wednesday in Alpharetta. My name is Elena Whitaker. I am 38 years old, and for the past 9 years, my world has revolved around one person, my son, Mason. Mason Whitaker is 9, 4th grade at Alpharetta Elementary School. Small for his age, quick on his feet, and fearless in a way only kids can be when they still believe the world is mostly good. Gymnastics is his whole life. Peachtree Youth Gymnastics Center sits about 6 blocks from our house. Most afternoons, you can find Mason there flipping off balance beams or swinging from uneven bars, while the other parents sit on metal benches, pretending not to hold their breath every time their kid leaves the ground. To Mason, the gym is freedom. When he's flipping through the air, he looks like gravity forgot to claim him. Sometimes when I watch him train, I still feel a strange wave of gratitude, because there was a time I thought I might lose everything. My husband, Mason's father, died in a car accident in 2018. Mason was barely 3 years old. I spent the next few years trying to rebuild a life that had suddenly collapsed in the middle. Single motherhood was never part of my plan, but somehow Mason and I figured it out. We built routines, homework at the kitchen table, Saturday pancakes, evenings at the gym. And eventually, I thought maybe there was room in that life for someone else. That someone was Grant Carter. I met Grant in 2021 through a mutual friend at a neighborhood barbecue. He was easy to talk to, the kind of man who always seemed calm no matter what was happening around him. At the time, he worked as a sales manager for a construction equipment company called Southern Ridge Equipment. He didn't try to impress Mason. He didn't push for the role of father. He just showed up, helped fix a broken cabinet door, came to one of Mason's practice sessions, sat quietly in the bleachers. When we got married in 2022, I told myself we were building something stable. For a while, it even felt true. Grant never demanded Mason call him Dad. He always said the same thing whenever someone asked. The kid already has a father. I'm just here to help. At the time, that sounded respectful. Now, I realize it also meant something else. The first cracks didn't appear until late 2023. They were small enough that I ignored them. Grant would glance at the registration email for a gymnastics competition and say something like, "The sport is getting expensive," or he would ask if Mason really needed another training camp over the summer. One afternoon, Mason ran into the house holding a small gold medal from a local meet. He was breathless with excitement. "Mom, I got first place on floor." I was hugging him when Grant walked into the kitchen. Mason held up the medal proudly. Grant looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. "That's nice." Then he opened the refrigerator. No smile, no congratulations, just a flat sentence that landed somewhere between polite and empty. I remember feeling a brief flicker of discomfort, but I brushed it off. Everyone has off days. Then early 2024 arrived, and things changed quickly. Grant came home one evening in February looking different, not angry exactly, but tense in a way I had never seen before. "The company's restructuring," he said. "They might cut my department." By March, it was official. Grant Carter was unemployed. At first, we tried to stay optimistic. I told him it would only be temporary. He had years of sales experience. Something would come up. But the weeks that followed started revealing a side of our finances I didn't fully understand. Credit card statements appeared in the mail, loan notices, emails marked urgent from debt collection agencies. I started opening the envelopes because Grant didn't seem eager to discuss them. That's when I learned he owed more than $68,000. The atmosphere in our house changed after that. Grant grew irritable, short-tempered. The calm man I had married started snapping on small things. One evening, while Mason was practicing handstands in the living room, Grant rubbed his temples and said something that stayed with me. "Sometimes it feels like everything in this house is about Mason." I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was joking, but he didn't laugh. As if that tension wasn't enough, there was also Grant's mother, Margaret Carter. Margaret is 66 years old and lives about half an hour away from Roswell. She ran a flower shop for most of her life and retired a few years ago. From the moment Grant introduced us, Margaret made it clear that Mason and I were not exactly the family she had imagined for her son. She never said it outright. She didn't have to. Comments like, "Grant deserves a real family," would slip into conversation during Sunday dinners, or she would look at Mason at the table and say things like, "Boys need a strong father figure." Then she would glance at Grant in a way that suggested the message was meant for him. I told myself she would warm up eventually. I was wrong. April 17th, 2024 started out like any other day. Work was busy. Mason had gymnastics practice that evening. Grant spent most of the afternoon in the home office scrolling job listings. Around 7:15, Mason grabbed his gym bag and headed out the door. The Peachtree Youth Gymnastics Center is close enough that he usually walks. "Text me when you get there," I told him. He nodded, already halfway out the door. The last thing I remember is the sound of the screen door snapping just behind him. About 25 minutes later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. When I answered, a man's voice spoke carefully, like someone trying not to cause panic. "Ma'am, are you Mason Whitaker's mother?" My stomach dropped instantly. "Yes." There was a pause. "Your son has been involved in an accident near the intersection by the gymnastics center." Everything after that felt unreal. The man explained that Mason had been struck by an SUV while crossing the street. The driver had stopped briefly, then panicked and left. Someone else called 911. An ambulance had already taken Mason to Northside Hospital. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I only remember the drive. My hands shook so badly on the steering wheel that I kept switching grips, afraid I might lose control of the car. Every red light felt like a personal attack. By the time I reached the emergency entrance, my legs were barely working. A nurse led me through double doors that smelled strongly of disinfectant. Mason was alive. That was the first thing they told me. Stable, but under observation. They had moved him to the ICU because of a head injury and possible fractures. When I finally saw him lying in that hospital bed, something inside my chest twisted so hard I thought I might collapse. Mason's face looked smaller somehow, pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. I sat beside him, holding his hand for what felt like hours. The hospital at night has a strange silence. Machines beep softly, footsteps echo down long hallways. Everything feels suspended. Then my phone vibrated. Margaret Carter. For a moment, I thought maybe Grant had told her what happened and she was calling to check on Mason. I answered. "Where are you?" No hello, no concern, just a question sharp enough to cut. "At the hospital," I said. "Mason was hit by a car." Margaret was quiet for a second. "Grant told me the boy is fine." I blinked. "He's in ICU." Another pause. Then Margaret said something that made my grip tighten around the phone. "My birthday dinner is tomorrow. I already told everyone you're cooking." I looked at Mason lying unconscious in the hospital bed. "Mason is in intensive care." Margaret let out a long sigh. "You're always dramatic, Elena." Then her voice hardened. "If you don't come help tonight, don't bother coming back to that house." The call ended before I could respond. About 10 minutes later, Grant called. His tone was calm, too calm. "Mom is just stressed," he said. "The doctor said Mason is stable, right? Try not to overreact." I remember staring at the dark window across the hospital room. Something about that conversation felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. I stayed beside Mason all night. I watched the machines, listened to the quiet hum of the hospital, and waited. Morning arrived slowly through the blinds. Around 9 o'clock, Mason's fingers moved. I leaned forward immediately. His eyes opened halfway. "Mason, honey, I'm already here." He blinked a few times, trying to focus. Then he squeezed my hand weakly. "Mom." I felt relief crash over me like a wave. "You're okay. You're safe." He swallowed and looked up at the ceiling. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. He pushed me. I leaned closer. "What did you say?" Mason turned his head toward me. "Grant pushed me." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my heart stop beating. "Who pushed you?" Mason didn't hesitate. "Grant." The room went completely silent.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 2. The Accusation. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. My brain kept searching for another explanation, something safer than the words that had just come out of my son's mouth. Grant. The man I married? The man who had eaten dinner at our table the night before? The man who had told me to calm down while our child lay in intensive care? I swallowed hard and leaned closer to Mason. "Honey, are you sure?" His eyes looked heavy from the medication, but they were steady. He nodded slightly. "I was at the crosswalk. I heard someone behind me." His voice was thin, but every word was deliberate. "I thought maybe it was another kid from the gym. Then I felt hands on my back." He paused, breathing shallowly. "He pushed me." My stomach tightened. "Who pushed you?" Mason blinked once, then said it again. "Grant." The certainty in his voice was worse than if he had sounded confused. He described the moment slowly, as if replaying it in his mind. He said he had started to step forward when the walk signal lit up. Then someone shoved him hard from behind. He fell into the street. The last thing he saw before he hit the pavement was Grant standing on the sidewalk. Dark jacket, white sneakers. My mind began scrambling for reasons this could not possibly be true. Maybe Mason had been dizzy. Maybe someone else was behind him and he saw Grant later. Maybe he was dreaming. But when I asked him again a few minutes later, his answer didn't change. Grant pushed me. The nurse noticed the tension in the room and quietly stepped outside. Within 20 minutes, 2 police officers arrived. A third man followed them inside. He introduced himself as Detective Marcus Hale with the Atlanta Police Department. Marcus Hale was tall and broad-shouldered, probably mid to late 40s. His hair had begun turning gray around the temples. He had the quiet, watchful expression of someone who had spent most of his career listening to terrible stories. He pulled a chair beside Mason's bed and lowered his voice. "Hey, buddy. My name is Marcus. I just want to talk for a minute." Mason looked at him cautiously. Marcus didn't rush him. "Do you feel okay enough to tell me what happened last night?" Mason glanced at me first. I squeezed his hand. "It's okay. Just tell the truth." Mason repeated the story exactly the same way he had told me. Crosswalk, footsteps behind him, a push. Grant. Marcus wrote everything down in a small notebook. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly to the name. When Mason finished, Marcus nodded once. "Thank you. That was very helpful." Then he stood and stepped into the hallway with me. His voice remained calm, but I could see a shift in his posture. "Kids sometimes misidentify people after an accident," he said, "but they usually change details when you ask twice." Mason didn't change anything. I stared at him. "What happens now?" Marcus took a breath. "Now we look at the evidence." He explained that because Mason had named someone specifically, the next step was to check Grant's movements and belongings. "We're going to need to take a look at your house." 2 patrol officers accompanied us back to Alpharetta. The drive felt unreal. The same streets I had driven every day now looked unfamiliar. Houses blurred past my window while my thoughts spun in circles. Grant pushed Mason. I kept repeating the sentence in my head as if it might eventually sound ridiculous enough to dismiss, but it never did. When we pulled into the driveway, our house looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Quiet, ordinary. Marcus walked up the front steps beside me. "You consent to a search of the home?" "Yes." The word came out automatically. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a strange chill. The house smelled faintly of whiskey. Marcus moved carefully through the living room and into the hallway. The first thing he noticed was the coat rack near the front door. A dark jacket hung there. He examined it without touching it at first. "Does your husband wear this often?" "Yes." Marcus signaled to one of the officers, who carefully removed the jacket and placed it into an evidence bag. Next, we walked into the bedroom. On the nightstand lay a printed movie ticket. Marcus picked it up and studied it. A theater in Roswell. Timestamp from the previous night. "Looks like an alibi," he said quietly. But the tone of his voice suggested he wasn't convinced. We moved into the kitchen. A nearly empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table, 2 glasses beside it. Marcus glanced at the bottle but didn't comment. Then he spotted Grant's phone lying face down near the edge of the table. "Your husband leave this behind often?" "No." Marcus looked at me. "Can you unlock it?" My hands hesitated for only a second. The passcode was our wedding date. I tapped the numbers and handed it to him. Marcus scrolled through the screen slowly. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What is it?" He turned the phone toward me. One of the most recent messages sat near the top of the screen. "Everything will be handled tomorrow." There was no name attached to the number, just a string of digits. The message had been sent the night before Mason's accident. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Marcus handed the phone to one of the officers for evidence processing. Then he asked if there were any documents or files belonging to Grant that might be relevant. Insurance paperwork, maybe? Financial records? "Mason's health insurance card is in his desk drawer," I said. We walked into Grant's small home office. The desk was cluttered with papers and unopened envelopes. I opened the top drawer, looking for Mason's health insurance information. Instead, my hand brushed across a thick folder I had never seen before. I pulled it out slowly. Inside was a neatly organized stack of documents. The first page was a life insurance policy. $200,000. My eyes moved down the page. Insured party, Mason Whitaker. Primary beneficiary, Grant Carter. I stared at the date, December 2023. My hands began to tremble. Marcus leaned closer. "You aware of this policy?" "No." My voice barely came out. I turned the next page. Another document slid partially free. A power of attorney form authorizing the sale of our house. Signed by me, except the signature wasn't mine. It looks like mine at first glance, but the longer I stared at it, the more obvious the differences became. Someone had practiced my handwriting. Marcus took the paper gently from my hands. "Forgery," he said quietly. Underneath the document was a printed sheet showing listings for condominiums in Miami. Several addresses had been circled in red ink. The room suddenly felt smaller. Grant had been planning something. Not an argument, not a divorce. A plan. Marcus stood silently for a long moment looking at the documents. Then he placed the folder into an evidence bag. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. This just became a lot bigger. I looked around the office that once felt like part of our home. Now it looked like the center of a lie. And for the first time since Mason whispered Grant's name in that hospital room, a new thought began forming in my mind. Maybe my son hadn't been mistaken at all.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 3: The Investigation. The possibilities settled into my mind like a weight I could not move. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the same moments again and again. Mason standing at the crosswalk, someone behind him, a shove strong enough to send the 9-year-old boy into traffic. Grant standing there, the man I had shared a house with for 2 years. The man who had told me not to overreact while our son lay in intensive care. Morning came gray and quiet through the hospital window. Mason was still asleep when Detective Marcus Hale called. I stepped into the hallway so I wouldn't wake him. He spoke calmly, the way people do when they know the information they're about to give you is difficult. Grant came in for questioning this morning. My heart started pounding. And he denies everything. Of course he did. Marcus continued. His attorney arrived within the hour, Evan Doyle. I recognized the name. Doyle had a reputation in Fulton County for defending difficult cases. Marcus paused briefly. They're pushing the same argument we expected. What argument? That Mason is confused, that he suffered a head injury and misidentified someone. I leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. He's not confused. I believe he believes what he saw, Marcus said carefully, but belief and proof are two different things in court. That was the first time the reality of the situation fully hit me. If Grant had done this, proving it would be an entirely different battle. When I returned to Mason's room, he was awake. His eyes followed me as I walked back to the chair beside his bed. Did the police talk to you again? Not yet. He studied my face. Mom? Yeah? You believe me, right? The question cut straight through my chest. I reached for his hand. Of course I believe you. He relaxed slightly. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. Margaret Carter. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Her voice exploded through the speaker the second I said hello. What exactly do you think you're doing? I pulled the phone away from my ear. What do you mean? You called the police on my son. My voice stayed quiet. Mason told them what happened. Margaret laughed sharply. He's a child, Elena. Children imagine things. He didn't imagine it. You are destroying Grant's life with these accusations. I could feel anger rising in my chest. Your son pushed my child into traffic. You don't know that. Her voice dropped into something colder. But if you keep pushing this story, you're going to regret it. The call ended before I could respond. I sat there staring at the phone for several seconds. Threat or warning? I couldn't tell which. The investigation moved quickly after that. Marcus called again the following day, asking me to come to the precinct to review some information. The police station felt sterile and quiet compared to the chaos of the hospital. Marcus spread several printed photographs across the table in front of me. Traffic camera stills. Grainy black and white images from the intersection near the gymnastics center. In the first frame, Mason stood at the crosswalk. In the second frame, a figure approached from behind. The face wasn't visible. The camera angle was too high. But the jacket was dark. The build looked familiar. Marcus tapped the photo. This was taken about 10 seconds before the accident. You can't see the face. No. But the height and body shape match Grant's pretty closely. My stomach tightened. Marcus slid another document across the table. Witness statement. An elderly woman named Linda Harper. I know her, I said quietly. She lives 2 houses down from us. Marcus nodded. Mrs. Harper told us she saw Grant leave the house around 7 last night. He told her he was heading to a movie. I looked at the timestamp on the statement. Mason was hit around 7:40. Marcus continued. Mrs. Harper said something else caught her attention. What? She said Grant looked rushed, not like someone heading out for a relaxing evening, more like someone going somewhere he needed to be. A silence filled the room. Marcus folded his hands. And then another witness came forward this morning. He handed me another report. A student from Alpharetta Middle School, Caleb Nguyen. The name meant nothing to me. Marcus explained. Caleb said he noticed a man hanging around the schedule board at the gymnastics center for the past couple of weeks, watching the practice times, asking questions. What kind of questions? What time the younger group finished practice? What nights they trained? My pulse began to race. Did he recognize the man? Marcus nodded slowly. He picked Grant out of a photo lineup. The room suddenly felt very small. He told the kid he was picking up his nephew, Marcus added, but Mason doesn't have cousins in that program. No. Which means Grant had been watching Mason's schedule, planning. Marcus leaned back in his chair. This doesn't look random, Elena. I swallowed. What does it look like? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gathered the photos into a neat stack. Let's keep collecting facts first. 2 days later, I returned to the house to collect some clothes and Mason's school backpack. The driveway looked exactly the same as it always had. The same oak tree in the front yard, the same basketball hoop near the garage. I walked up the front steps and slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. My chest tightened. I stepped back and examined the door. The lock had been replaced. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at it. Then I heard a sound above me, a window sliding open. I looked up. A woman leaned out from the second-floor window, blonde hair, perfect makeup, one hand resting on the window frame. Tara Lawson. I recognized her instantly from social media photos I had once seen on Grant's phone. She looked down at me with mild curiosity. Oh. Her tone sounded almost amused. You must be Elena. My throat felt dry. What are you doing in my house? Tara tilted her head slightly. Grant told me you moved out. The words didn't make sense. Moved out? She shrugged lightly. That's what he said. Then she placed a hand on her stomach. That's when I noticed the curve beneath her shirt. She was pregnant. How far along are you? She smiled faintly. 4 months. The world around me tilted slightly. Behind her, I could see parts of the hallway that had once been my home. My picture frames were gone from the wall. Grant told me he was separating from you, Tara continued casually. Said things had been over for a while. I stared at her. Grant is in police custody. The smile on her face faltered for a moment. What? Before I could answer, my phone rang again. Marcus. I stepped away from the house and answered. We just finished reviewing the evidence collected from your home, he said. I glanced back at the window where Tara still stood watching. And? Marcus's voice grew quieter. Between the insurance policy, the forged documents, the witness statements, and the surveillance footage, the pattern is becoming clearer. My heart pounded in my chest. What pattern? He paused. Then he said the words that made my blood run cold. This wasn't random. It looks planned.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 4. The Motive. The word planned echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I stood on the sidewalk outside the house that had once been mine, staring at the front door that no longer opened for me. Tara Lawson was still at the upstairs window, watching like a curious stranger observing someone else's argument. For a moment, I felt like I was floating outside my own life. Grant had replaced the locks. Grant had moved another woman into our house. Grant had taken out a life insurance policy on my 9-year-old son, and now the police believe the attack might not have been an accident at all. I walked slowly back to my car. Tara called down from the window. Wait! I looked up. Her expression had changed slightly. The casual confidence was gone. What did you mean he's in police custody? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say nothing, but the exhaustion of the past few days had burned away my patience. He was questioned by the police, I said, about what happened to Mason. She frowned. What happened to Mason? I stared at her. You don't know? Grant hadn't told her. Of course he hadn't. My son was pushed into traffic, I said. Her face tightened. What are you talking about? I shook my head. You should ask Grant. I got into my car and drove away before the conversation could continue. The next morning, Detective Marcus Hale asked me to meet him again. This time, the meeting wasn't at the precinct. It was at a small conference room inside the Fulton County Administrative Building. The room was quiet except for the hum of an overhead light. Marcus was already there with a thick folder spread across the table. He gestured for me to sit. I wanted to walk you through what we've found so far. I sat down slowly. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements, credit reports, and loan documents. We ran a financial background on Grant, Marcus said. He slid the first page toward me. Grant Carter, Southern Ridge Equipment. Employment terminated March 2024. My stomach tightened. Marcus continued. 3 credit cards over the limit, 1 personal loan currently in collections. He pointed to a figure circled in red. Total debt sits at about $68,000. I stared at the number. Grant had never told me the full amount. Marcus leaned back slightly. Financial stress alone doesn't prove motive, but combined with the life insurance policy and the forged property documents, it creates a pattern. I felt the room grow colder. Kind of pattern. Marcus studied my face carefully before answering. The kind where someone starts seeing money as a solution. My throat tightened. He turned another page in the file. This is the life insurance policy you found. $200,000. Insured party, Mason Whitaker. Primary beneficiary, Grant Carter. Marcus tapped the page gently. If Mason had died that night, this policy would have paid out. The sentence felt like a punch to my chest. And there's more. He slid another document across the table. Printed property listings from Miami. High-rise condos overlooking the water. Grant had circled 3 of them in red pen. Marcus continued, speaking quietly. We also spoke with Tara Lawson this morning. I looked up. What did she say? Grant told her he was planning to relocate. To Miami. He said he was going to sell the house. The forged power of attorney flashed through my mind again. Marcus watched my reaction carefully. He told her the 2 of them were starting a new life. My hands began to tremble slightly. All the pieces were beginning to form a shape I didn't want to see. Grant had been preparing to leave. With Tara. With money. Marcus closed the folder slowly. If Mason had died that night, Grant would have had $200,000 from the policy. He paused. Plus the equity from selling the house. The math was suddenly horrifyingly simple. Grant would have walked away with a fresh start. My son would have been gone. The realization hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the table. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Marcus waited quietly. Elena, I know this is a lot. I nodded slowly. Memories began surfacing in my mind, small moments I had ignored. Grant standing in the kitchen months earlier. I never wanted to raise another man's kid. At the time, I thought he was just venting after a stressful day. Another memory. Margaret Carter sitting at our dining room table during Christmas dinner. Real family matters. I had forced a polite smile and pretended not to understand the implication. Now every one of those moments felt like a warning sign I had missed. Later that afternoon, I returned to Northside Hospital. Mason was sitting up slightly in bed when I walked into the room. His leg was in a brace and his forehead still carried a faint bruise, but his eyes were brighter. Hey, Mom. Hey, buddy. I kissed his hair and sat down beside him. For a few minutes, we talked about normal things. School, his friends, whether his team would still compete in the regional meet. But underneath the conversation, my mind kept circling the same terrible thought. Grant had planned this. That evening, another visitor arrived, Margaret Carter. She walked into the hospital room like she owned the place, her posture stiff and her expression already irritated. Her eyes moved from Mason to me. "I heard you're still telling people Grant tried to hurt him." Her tone was sharp enough to cut through the air. Mason looked confused. "Grandma?" Margaret barely glanced at him. "This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." I stood up slowly. "You shouldn't be here." She ignored that. "My son is sitting in a police station right now because you decided to believe a child who just suffered a head injury." My voice stayed low. "He told the police what happened." Margaret crossed her arms. "He fell. He was pushed." Her eyes hardened. "You have always had a dramatic imagination." Something inside me snapped. My son could have died. Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt even colder. "You should have kept that boy under control." The words hung in the air like poison. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She had just referred to Mason as that boy, not his grandson, not even his name, just that boy. Mason shifted slightly in the bed. "Grandma, I didn't fall." Margaret looked at him then, finally. Her expression softened for half a second. Then it hardened again. "You don't understand what you're saying." I stepped between them. "Leave." She raised her eyebrows. "You don't get to tell me where I can stand. Get out." The nurse at the door stepped forward, clearly sensing the tension. Margaret exhaled sharply and turned toward the hallway. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at me. "You're making a mistake." Then she walked out. The room fell silent again. Mason watched the doorway for a moment. "Why is she mad?" I sat back down beside him. "She loves Grant," I said quietly, "and sometimes people can't accept when someone they love does something terrible." Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "He did push me." I squeezed his hand. "I know." That night, as I sat beside his hospital bed, the pieces of the story finally locked together in my mind. Grant had been watching Mason's schedule. Grant had taken out a life insurance policy. Grant had forged documents to sell our house. Grant had been planning to leave with Tara, and the only thing standing between him and $200,000 was my son. Grant Carter had not lost his temper. He made a decision.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. The Trial. The months that followed felt like living inside a long hallway with no doors. Winter came and went in Georgia. Mason healed slowly. The police investigation turned into formal charges. Lawyers appeared. Depositions were scheduled. Court dates moved, then moved again. Life became a series of waiting rooms. By the time the trial finally began in early 2025, I felt older than the year that had passed. Fulton County Courthouse stood in downtown Atlanta like a massive gray block against the morning sky. The building had an intimidating quiet to it, the kind that made every footstep echo louder than it should. I held Mason's hand as we walked through the security checkpoint. His legs still stiffened when he walked too long, but the doctors said the damage would not be permanent. Therapy had helped. The brace was gone now. He looked small, standing in the wide marble hallway. "You okay?" I asked softly. He nodded. "I just want it to be over." So did I. Inside the courtroom, everything felt colder than the hospital had months earlier. Grant sat at the defense table beside his attorney, Evan Doyle. He wore a navy suit and looked strangely calm, like someone attending a business meeting rather than a criminal trial. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. He looked away first. The courtroom slowly filled with people. Reporters sat in the back row. Curious observers whispered quietly to each other. Margaret Carter sat several rows behind the defense table, her back straight and her expression rigid. Judge Harold Benton entered, and everyone stood. The trial began with the slow, careful rhythm of the American legal system. Prosecutor Renee Caldwell stood before the jury with a stack of documents in her hands. She was calm, composed, and precise with every word. Over the next several hours, she built the story piece by piece. First came the surveillance footage. The screen near the jury box displayed still images from the traffic camera near Peachtree Youth Gymnastics Center. The jurors leaned forward slightly. In the first frame, Mason stood at the crosswalk waiting for the signal. In the next frame, a taller figure approached from behind. The image was grainy, the face impossible to see clearly, but the clothing matched what Mason had described months earlier. Dark jacket, white sneakers. Renee spoke quietly as the images changed. The individual approaching the child matches the clothing worn by the defendant that evening. Next came the witness statements. Mrs. Linda Harper described seeing Grant leave the neighborhood around 7 o'clock that night. He looked rushed, she said from the witness stand, not like someone going to see a movie. Caleb Nien testified next. The teenage boy shifted nervously in his chair, but answered each question clearly. I saw him at the gym a few times before that, Caleb said. What was he doing there? Renee asked. Looking at the practice board. And did he say why he was there? Caleb nodded. He said he was picking up his nephew. Murmurs moved through the courtroom. Renee paused briefly before continuing. Did you recognize that man when police later showed you photographs? Caleb pointed across the room. Yeah, that's him. His finger aimed directly at Grant. Grant didn't react. Then the financial evidence came. Renee placed a thick binder on the evidence table and walked the jury through Grant's employment records from Southern Ridge Equipment. Mr. Carter lost his position in March of 2024, she explained. Next came the credit card statements. 3 accounts over their limits, a personal loan on the verge of default, total debt exceeding $68,000. I watched the jurors exchange quiet glances as the numbers appeared on the screen. Then Renee introduced the document that had changed everything months earlier, the life insurance policy. She held the page up for the jury. Insured party, Mason Whitaker. Beneficiary, Grant Carter. Policy value, $200,000. Grant's attorney rose from his seat. Objection. Judge Benton shook his head. Overruled. The document went to the jury. Finally, Renee presented the forged power of attorney forms and the Miami condo listings. The defendant was preparing to sell the home he shared with the victim's mother and relocate to Miami, she explained calmly, and relocate to Miami. The puzzle was forming in front of the jury. A child, a life insurance policy, a man in debt, a plan to leave town. When the prosecution rested, Evan Doyle stood slowly. His approach was different. He focused on doubt. He walked toward the jury box with his hands clasped loosely behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, the entire case you have just heard depends on the memory of a 9-year-old child who suffered a head injury. He turned toward Mason. Mason had to testify. Watching my son walk to the witness stand was one of the hardest moments of my life. He looked so small in that chair. Evan Doyle approached him gently. Mason, you were hurt that night, correct? Yes. You hit your head? Yes. Doyle nodded thoughtfully. And sometimes when people hit their heads, memories can become confused. Mason didn't respond. He leaned slightly closer. Is it possible you were mistaken about who pushed you? Mason looked directly at him. No. The single word hung in the air. Doyle tried again. You only saw the person for a second. Mason shook his head. He was right behind me. How do you know it was Grant? Mason took a breath. I know how he walks. For a moment, even Doyle seemed caught off guard. The courtroom remains completely silent. Then came the witness no one had expected, Thomas Brooks, the driver of the SUV. When he walked into the courtroom, I felt my stomach twist. Brooks had fled the scene that night out of panic. Months later, he came forward after recognizing the case in a news report. He looked nervous as he took the stand. His hands shook slightly. Renee Caldwell spoke gently. "Mr. Brooks, please describe what you saw that evening." Brooks cleared his throat. "I was driving through the intersection when I saw the boy step into the crosswalk." He paused. "And then I saw someone behind him." "What happened next?" Brooks swallowed. "I saw the man push the boy forward." The words seemed to freeze the air. Renee asked the question carefully. "Do you see that man in this courtroom today?" Brooks slowly turned his head. His finger lifted. "I do." He pointed across the room, directly at Grant. "I saw him push the boy." A wave of tension moved through the courtroom. Grant shifted in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, his calm expression cracked. Evan Doyle quickly stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Brooks, it was dark that night, correct?" "Yes." "You were driving a moving vehicle?" "Yes." "So you only saw the person for a brief moment?" Brooks hesitated. Then he looked directly at Grant again. "I'm certain enough." The juror members exchanged glances. The tension in the courtroom felt almost physical. When the final witness stepped down, the room had grown so quiet that even the turning of a page sounded loud. Grant sat rigidly beside his attorney. For the first time, I noticed sweat forming along his hairline. Renee Caldwell rose for closing arguments. She spoke slowly. "This case is not complicated." She gestured toward Mason. "A child told the truth." Then toward Grant. "And a man made a choice." When the jury left the room to deliberate, the silence in the courtroom felt unbearable. I reached for Mason's hand. He squeezed back. 3 hours passed before the jury returned. The foreperson stood. Everyone held their breath. The verdict had not yet been spoken, but something in the jurors' faces told me that the moment we had all been waiting for was finally here. Chapter 6. Karma. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the foreperson stood. Every sound disappeared. The shuffle of papers, the quiet whispering from the back rows. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop humming. The judge asked the question everyone in the room had been waiting for. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." My hand tightened around Mason's fingers. He sat beside me perfectly still. His shoulders were straight, his eyes fixed on the jurors, trying to look braver than a 9-year-old should ever have to be. The judge continued. "On the charge of aggravated assault and attempted murder, how do you find the defendant?" The foreperson looked directly toward the defense table. "Guilty." The word echoed through the room like something physical. For a moment, no one moved. Grant stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his eyes empty. Behind him, Margaret Carter let out a small sound that was almost a gasp, but not quite. Mason squeezed my hand. I didn't realize until that moment that I had been holding my breath. The next hearing came weeks later, sentencing. By then, the media attention had faded. The reporters who had once crowded the back rows were gone. Only a few observers remained. But the tension in the room felt heavier than it had during the trial. Grant stood beside his attorney, his wrists resting lightly on the defense table. Judge Harold Benton looked down at the sentencing report in front of him. "Mr. Carter, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Before I determine your sentence, you have the right to address the court." Grant had been silent throughout most of the trial. Now he slowly stood. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then suddenly, his voice broke through the quiet. "Yes." Every head in the courtroom lifted. Grant looked directly toward the judge. Yes, I did it. The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps spread through the room. Even Evan Doyle turned sharply toward his own client, clearly not expecting what was happening. Grant's voice grew louder, raw with frustration that had apparently been building for months. I pushed him. He pointed toward Mason. The boy ruined everything. My stomach dropped. Grant continued, his voice trembling with anger. Everything in that house was about him, his competitions, his training, his future. He laughed bitterly. And I was supposed to just stand there and play happy stepfather? The courtroom remains completely silent. Grant kept talking, as if the confession had opened something inside him that could no longer be controlled. I was drowning in debt. My job was gone. I needed a way out. He looked briefly toward the gallery where Tara Lawson sat. We were going to Miami, starting over. His shoulders rose and fell as he breathed. The insurance would have taken care of everything. For a moment, no one spoke. Judge Benton made it until Grant finished. Then he folded his hands together calmly. Mr. Carter, the lack of remorse you have shown here today is deeply disturbing. He paused, his voice steady and firm. You deliberately endangered the life of a child in pursuit of financial gain. He looked down at the sentencing document once more. For these crimes, this court sentences you to 22 years in the Georgia Department of Corrections. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the room like a door slamming shut. Two deputies approached and placed handcuffs on Grant's wrists. As they turned him toward the exit, he glanced around the courtroom one last time. His eyes briefly met mine. There was no apology there, only anger. Then he was gone. For several seconds, no one moved. Then chairs began scraping softly across the floor as people stood. Tara Lawson rose from the gallery. She looked pale, like someone who had just realized the life she imagined was built on something rotten. Slowly, she pulled the engagement ring from her finger. Without saying a word, she walked to the trash bin near the courtroom door and dropped it inside. Then she left. Margaret Carter remained seated long after everyone else had begun filing out. She stared at the empty space where Grant had been standing. Her shoulders looked smaller somehow, like the certainty she had carried for years had finally collapsed. Months passed. Mason's recovery became our new routine, 3 physical therapy sessions each week. Balance drills, strength training. Some days he progressed quickly, other days frustration got the better of him. One afternoon he stumbled during an exercise and slammed his fist lightly against the therapy mat. I used to be better than this. I knelt beside him. You will be again. The first time he jogged across the gym without limping, the therapist clapped quietly. Mason looked surprised. Then he smiled. Life slowly began rebuilding itself around those small victories. One afternoon, 6 months after the sentencing, someone knocked on our apartment door. When I opened it, Margaret Carter stood in the hallway. She looked older. Her posture had softened. The rigid confidence she once carried had disappeared. In her hands, she held a small envelope. I sold the house, she said quietly. I didn't respond. She held the envelope out. There is money in here for Mason's therapy. I hesitated. She continued. I believed him. Her voice cracked slightly. I shouldn't have. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, I accepted the envelope, but when she opened her mouth to say something else, I shook my head gently. Some things can't be repaired. She seemed to understand. Margaret nodded once and then walked slowly down the hallway. That was the last time I saw her. 6 months later, Mason and I moved north, a smaller town outside Chattanooga. New school, new apartment, a place where the past felt a little farther away. One Saturday morning, Mason asked if we could visit a gymnastics center nearby. The building smelled the same as the one back in Alpharetta. Rubber mats, chalk dust, kids laughing while coaches shouted encouragement. Mason stood near the entrance for a long time. You don't have to rush, I said. He nodded. Then he walked out onto the floor. Not to compete, not yet, just to move, to feel his body working again. Later that night, he sat on the floor of his room organizing his old medals. He picked up one and turned it slowly in his hands. "Mom? Yeah? Do you think he understands what he did?" For a moment, I thought about the courtroom, the confession, the prison sentence waiting for him. Then I looked at Mason. "That's not our problem anymore." He nodded quietly. Outside the window, the evening air was calm. For the first time in a long while, our lives felt peaceful. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trusted enough to let inside your home. And sometimes surviving something like this means learning how to rebuild your world from the ground up. But I still think about that moment in the hospital when Mason first whispered the truth. If you had been sitting in that chair beside your child, hearing the name of someone you loved, would you have believed them immediately, or would you have struggled the way I did? Let me know what you think. And if stories like this make you reflect on the people around you, stay here with us. There are many more stories waiting to be told.